Year 12. Let's look at an essay question for comparative. So the essay question I've got in front of me, and you should have in front of you, says, compare the ways in which citizens are oppressed in their everyday lives in 1984 and Stasiland. What long-term impact does this have upon key figures in the text? So oppression and the impact of oppression for key figures, all right? So let's unpack some key words before we go any further. So the first thing I've noted here is the word citizens. So who can we talk about? So you might disagree with me. You might have more people that you want to talk about. But when I was planning this, I thought of 3 people in particular. I thought about Winston, who introduces us to the oppressive society of 1984. Then I thought about Julia, and I mean the Julia from Stasiland, okay, whose oppression impacts her later life. And then I thought about Miriam and how at the end of Stasiland, Miriam can't move on. Because for me, they were the characters from Stasiland that stood out. And of course, in 1984, we really only have Winston and Julia as our key figures, all right? Now then I was wanting to talk about oppression. So I was like trying to unpack the word oppressed in relation to this. So oppressed means subject to harsh and authoritarian treatment. So in this case, we need to look at the government's treatment of the people. So the party in 1984, okay, so 1984, the party insert Big Brother, and in Stasiland we say the GDR, or the former GDR is probably the best way to describe the party that was in control. And then it says long term, all right. I said for Stasiland, this is after the wall came down. Okay, and Funda does a lot of looking at what their lives are like, of course, because it's a retrospective narration. She's interviewing them after the fall of the wall. And then, of course, in 1984, it means after Winston and Julia are captured and what happens to them. So the fact that in the end, Winston's a broken man and he loves Big Brother. All right, and then I've unpacked that further over here where I've talked about key figures. And I've said Winston at the end of the text remains oppressed. He loved Big Brother, so the oppression breaks him. Julia can't seem to settle. She's like, there's no set appointments, etc. And Miriam can't move on. Even at the end of the text, she's still waiting for answers about Charlie. She's waiting for Charlie. It seems like she'll never be happy in this life with Charlie taken away from her. So that's the unpacking of the question, okay? Now, these are my ideas for paragraphs, and we had a bit of a chat about this in my English class today, and I think Miss Hando's class chatted about this today. You might have different paragraph ideas, and that's totally fine. These are just 3 that I sort of was working with based on something I'd read, based on some ideas, okay? But if you've got something else and you think it works, just have a chat to your English teacher, and by all means go with it. We're all about you coming up with your own ideas. What we're doing on these screencasts and in class is just a jumping off point so everyone has something to do. But if you want to add or change things, go ahead. So I've said here that the first paragraph needs to be about surveillance. And I've phrased it as a question. What is the difference in the surveillance between the 2 regimes? You might say in 1984, it's the continual watching and the extent of the technology. And in Stasiland, we don't see that technology yet. So the surveillance isn't as developed. Then I wanted to talk about personal freedom because I felt that oppression means that these characters, as in the characters in both 1984 and Stasiland, don't have any personal freedom, right? They don't have a whole lot of, independence, I suppose, you know, and that's because they are so oppressed. And that relates to relationships. You know, we talked a lot today about relationships and how relationships are impacted as a result of oppression. And I think that's a really interesting point that was made, that, you know, they can't seem to have these relationships. And even in some cases in their later lives in Stasiland, they still can't seem to have these relationships by any means. Then paragraph 3 is control of the truth and information. You can probably hear the thunder in the background. So information has to be carefully monitored. It's something that they have to control continually. You know, they have to have a complete grip of it, sort of thing. So that's really interesting. Now I've put 3 topic sentences to the side here. I'm not going to read them to you. They're there for you. I quite like the second and the third. I said this afternoon in my class. I really don't love the first one. So maybe that's what you can do. You can write a better first topic sentence, okay? Again, you can write your own topic sentences totally. This is just to get you started, okay? You need to write a few essays, all right, before you're comfortable with it in time for the SAC. So the more you can do, and I said to my class, it'd be great if you could start off with one essay per week, and if you could build up from there, that'd be even better. And you know, if you could get them in before Friday instead of always leaving it to the weekend, that'd also be really good. I've put on here a bit of a plan for an introduction, okay? So it's all about the structure of your introduction, and I'll just remind you here how an introduction should basically look. So it should have an opening sentence, a sentence that's about the text in general, and we had a bit of a discussion today about, you know, what's a good opening sentence, what's a bad opening sentence, etc., etc. All right, I'm just gonna pause it. Okay, so sorry I had to pause, but the hail got a bit intense and I got distracted. So we were talking about the structure of an introduction, and I was saying it's really important when we're looking at two texts to have a really clear structure. And I said you would go with the opening sentence about the text in general, then we reword the question, we outline our three arguments, and we clearly answer and refer back to the question. Now what we've got to be careful of is that in our opening sentence and rewording the question, we address both texts, that we look at 1984 and the Stasiland. And then of course here with our three arguments, we need to make sure that our arguments, because we want an integrated response, also address both texts, okay? So we're not just going to talk about surveillance in 1984, we're going to talk about surveillance in 1984 and Stasiland. We're going to compare it as well. And comparing doesn't just mean saying how they're the same. Comparing also means, and sometimes you guys seem to forget this, saying how things are different. So I asked you in class today, and hopefully Miss Hando did too, to find some examples of your own. So if you haven't done this, I want you to pause this right now, and I want you to spend no more than 10 minutes, just off the top of your head. What's an example of surveillance in 1984? What's an example of surveillance in Stasi? And then do the same for personal freedom and for control of the truth and information. And if you've got a quote in mind, try and write down your quote, because this is a really good way to just start doing this. Every time you see a question, you just go, okay, my three paragraphs are going to be this, this, and this, and I'm going to talk about this and this, okay? We did this a lot for Mouse. You guys got really good at it, okay? You know, I remember one session clearly where you guys just threw essay questions up on the board, and then together you worked to try and come up with different paragraph ideas. And that was the idea behind your holiday homework as well. With those different themes that you wrote paragraphs on and the different characters that you might have read about, you should be able to now look at a question and think to yourself, okay, so I could use the following three paragraphs, or you might choose 4. I've been going for 3 because I'm more comfortable with it that way. I've put some examples up here about surveillance, personal freedom, control of the truth, and information. So for surveillance, and this doesn't necessarily mean that I use these in my essay, it was just when I was trying to do it myself, what came to mind. Well, surveillance, the tally screens in 1984, all right? And the comparison I would make with that is the fact that 1 in every 6.5 people were informers for the Stasi. So the Stasi don't have the technology, but they've got the manpower, okay? Then we're doing personal freedom, and I was thinking about Julia and the creation of the Junior Anti-Sex League, because I was thinking about how, like, part of that elimination of freedom is getting rid of love and passion. And then I was like, oh, boyfriend, love, passion. Well, I also need to talk about Julia and the Italian boyfriend. And I love the quote that I put there. It says, it's the total surveillance that damaged me the worst. I think that works really well with this essay question. Control of the truth. At the end of the book, O'Brien tells Winston, you will have never existed, which is just like the ultimate power of the party. Like, to say to someone you no longer exist, like, that's just like, it's so dystopian, it's so far still into our future. Okay, then we go to the control of information with regards to Charlie's death, this terrible game of waiting. I'm sorry, my phone's going off left, right, and center. All right, Now I've outlined the body paragraphs for you, okay? So I've tried to give you a topic sentence and a linking sentence each time. So that's what I've highlighted at the top of each page, and you can see it on the following pages as well, okay? I would encourage you to maybe try and rewrite the topic sentences so that they make sense to you. All right, so like this one in particular, and I know I keep harping on about it, but it's not the best. So many characters are under surveillance in Stasiland, and all characters are continually watched in 1984. I think we can say that a bit better. That's a really like dumb statement. So I don't know what else you'd say. Maybe you'd say in both Stasiland and 1984, surveillance seems to be a prevalent aspect of the control that the regimes have over the citizens, or something like that. And then I've tried to incorporate heaps of quotes for you. I haven't always got the page references for you. I've tried as much as possible, though, to put some page references in. You need to talk to your individual teacher about whether they want page references in your SACs or not, okay? But I've tried to put them in just for those of you who are still having some trouble annotating. You might want to go back to your text and annotate. So, for example, you could like go, oh, page 5, every sound you made was overheard. Like I could use that. And I've even started just putting like a doggy ear on some of the pages with the best quotes as I've been rereading. And I've annotated both my books, but I still feel like I'm not done. I still feel like I'm picking more stuff out of it. And the one thing I'd say is just that when you're writing your essays, please have your books like in front of you. And if you've done your annotations well, you should be able to like just flick and really easily find them. And then by the time we get to the SAC, hopefully you're really confident with the quotes. Hopefully you've just got them in your memory bank. And if you're struggling with putting quotes, you know, into context or remembering them sort of thing, just make sure that you maybe print these out, or that you learn the quotes that are in the different essays, for example, you know, because even just on this page we've got what, like 6 different quotes, okay, that you could teach yourself. If nothing else, you could remember the quotes that are in this essay. So again, it's all about scaffolding it to your own ability. Some of you might be able to remember heaps of quotes from the books, no worries. Some of you might really struggle and you might have to make a focus on this, okay? I would say just find a way that works for you. All right, so first paragraph, talk about surveillance, talk about Winston, talk about the characters in Stasiland being mindful of what they can watch. Okay, so we were talking about surveillance and the whole idea of surveillance in paragraph 1. So then we move on to paragraph 2, and we're talking about personal freedom, okay? And in particular, we're going to talk about relationships, all right? So I've altered this topic sentence a little bit because today that's where my class went. We started to discuss that idea of relationships. So first of all, we talk about the relationship of Julia and Winston, okay? Because their relationship is interesting because sexual desire is controlled. And we know this because of Winston's reflections about Catherine, his wife, okay? And how it was sex was just seen as their duty to the party and there was no passion. So for Winston and Julia to be passionately in love and to be acting in a sexual manner is a blow struck against the party. It's a form of rebellion. All right, and then I think we also see this rebellion in Stasiland through Hagen Kosh in some ways, because I think the Stasi was seeking to control Hagen Kosh's marriage because they didn't approve of his wife, okay, and so his own relationship is impacted by the Stasi because they make her divorce him in some ways, all right, and they do end up though getting back together, so you could say that that's a bit of a positive, you know, and especially you could say that in Stasiland there's a bit of hope because, like, for example, Hagen Kosh and his wife, reconcile, whereas, like, you know, at the end of 1984, Winston and Julia, like, no longer love each other, you know, the whole I betrayed you, and you could also say that with Julia, whose relationship is impacted through the Italian boyfriend, that she still regards fixed appointments as intolerable constraints on her freedom. So, like, the idea that she still suffers long after because of what happened to her as well. Then body paragraph 3 is control of information. So the fact that both parties, so the former GDR and the party and Big Brother, like they want total control over like all the information and everything that the citizens are fed, okay? And you know, this is seen so clearly in the propaganda, I think, and you know, a lot of you hopefully annotated, you know, the examples of propaganda in your books, and I thought propaganda in both texts was something that was really interesting. You know, the first thing that came to my mind as soon as it said, you know, control of information, I was like, oh, who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past, because that's like your really famous 1984 quote. And then I was trying to think about like propaganda and surveillance in Stasiland, and I was thinking about like the quotes about, you know, if the files afterwards were laid on the ground and how it would be 180 kilometers long. I was like, that for me is the example of surveillance, all right? And then I wanted to sort of, you know, use something to show that surveillance is so prevalent. So I used this quote, the GDR was like religion, because that's something we talked about in class as part of our passage analysis, and it's something I thought was really interesting. You know, Winston can see beyond the propaganda of the party, but then at the end he can't, because he says 2 + 2 = 5, you know, which suggests again that the regime in 1984 does completely control the information and also controls the citizens, okay? So you can't actually rebel even if you want to. And then your conclusion clearly answered the question. So just to recap, your question was compare the ways in which citizens are oppressed in their everyday lives in 1984 in Stasiland. What long-term impact does this have upon key figures? So if I was to answer my question, I'd say the state doesn't necessarily care for the citizens, all right? When the oppression ends, all right, the effects of the oppression has not, okay, because the long-term impact there, Julia tries to choose how the regime, it should say, affects her in the long term, but she doesn't necessarily succeed with that. And then we'd say here, Winston's in the worst position of all, because despite initially being independent, he is broken. Okay, so that's your first question. Compare the ways in which citizens are oppressed in their everyday lives in 1984 in Stasiland. What long-term impact does this have upon key figures in the text? So you've got this screencast, you've got the notes from my class, if you're in Miss Hando's class, you've got the notes from that. Miss Brooks's class will be doing that next week. What I would really love it is if people could have a crack at this essay, all right, if they could try and write a draft and maybe send it in to their English teachers, use this as a starting point, as a jumping off point, okay? If you've got questions, come and see your English teacher, okay? It's about close reading, it's about doing the work. Go back over these slides, listen to the screencast, look at your notes from class. Thanks, Year 12.